And I would like to now introduce you to our amazing speaker today. As many of you may already know, Alistair Lee. He's our Senior Product Enablement Manager here on the Connect team. Alistair helps enable customers to communicate, collaborate, and train more effectively. During his 25-year tenure at Adobe, Alistair has held a number of technology-related roles that include consulting, evangelism, and marketing. His focus over the past decade has been on e-learning and webinars. And with that, the floor is yours, Alistair.
Thank you so much, Alna. Thank you, everybody, for joining our session today. I am really excited to be here speaking about design. I think this is one of the core principles of a successful virtual classroom. So as I said, it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start off with a poll. I would love to get your feedback. And what I'd like to ask is what you feel are the biggest challenges of moving your content online. When you think about online delivery, especially compared to in-person delivery in a physical room, what are you seeing as the biggest challenges? I'm going to broadcast these results in just a second. Going to wait till a few people answer. Here we go. So let me go ahead and broadcast these. I'm seeing engagement, keeping learners engaged, creating teacher presence. I think that's a challenge we've all had, especially during the pandemic, is enabling that presence. Limits of using an LMS, feedback, engagement, translating the engagement of live with virtual. How do we do that? One of our speakers tomorrow is going to speak about digital body language. How do we read somebody's body language when we're online compared to virtual or compared to in person? Feedback, engagement, effective virtual instructors, engagement. I'm seeing the same theme come up a lot around this idea of engagement. And I think that is one of the key challenges. How do we engage as we move our content online, as we move our delivery online? I'm going to talk about three of what I think are the most fundamental principles today: content, interaction, and design. And I'm going to spend most of the time talking about interaction and design. We've got a very limited time today. I want to make sure we use it effectively. So even though I'm going to spend most of the time talking about interaction and design, let's talk about whether interaction is required. Let me go to another poll. So use the agree to disagree pod just below my headshot there if you think interaction is required for engagement. Do you need to have interaction if you want to engage? Hit the green check mark if you think you do, and hit the red X if you don't think it's absolutely necessary. And then if you've hit the green check mark, use the chat box on the top. Tell me why you think interaction is required. If you've chosen no, it's not required, then use the chat box on the bottom of the layout. So Susan's talking about retention. If you want people to remember what they've been learning. Interaction is, I'll scroll very quickly. Interaction is crucial to engagement. Absolutely. You want to gauge somebody's level of retention, learner retention. A lot of people talking about engagement and retention here. Still waiting for some answers in the why it may not be required. Ian is saying if something is visually stunning, it can engage. Jessica saying when it's just information. These are some good points. I'm gonna give people another second here to respond using the chat pod of their preference. But I think there are valid arguments on both sides here, whether interaction is required. And required is a bit of a loaded word. When you think of content, for example, I sat through 3 hours of the movie Avengers Endgame. And I was engaged throughout the entire 3-hour event. Now, this had a $300 million budget. I'm guessing your e-learning budgets are less than $300 million, maybe not even in the $100 million and up category. Maybe you're just dealing with millions or tens of millions. It is difficult to engage with people if you're not using interaction, but it is certainly possible. As Ian said earlier, if the content is engaging enough, it can provide its own interaction. We saw that with today's keynote speaker as well. That wasn't necessarily an interactive session, but we had the right level of engagement during that session. What interaction can help us do, though, is turn our viewers into participants. We can add this level of participation, which can really help enable that interaction, that engagement, and as people said on the previous chat pod, the retention rate after the session itself. Apologies for the dead air. I've literally dropped my mouse on the floor, just trying to find that so I can change to the next slide.
I'm happy to change that for you, Alistair.
Thank you, Alna. So let's talk about interaction in the context of digital learning. So first, what are some of the ways that we can provide interaction during a virtual session? I've got another poll pod in here. So tell me, how can you provide interaction in your virtual classrooms? Some fantastic answers coming in here. Let me go ahead and broadcast these results. Q&A, thoughtful questions, asking people to read, participants to read aloud, using the chat box, using polls, breakout rooms, games, quizzes, questions. A lot of people saying polls. Some really great ideas here. How can we have people interact in our sessions? I've taken a look at this from the So what I've done is I've grouped these into 3 different buckets. These are some of the interaction features that we've got in Adobe Connect. And some of these are really easy to use and take virtually no preparation. And some of them are a little more. So what I want to do today is go through some of these interaction features and show you how you can design them into your virtual classroom sessions. We'll start with the basics, things that take no preparation at all, like asking somebody to set their status to agree or disagree. We can just ask a question off the cuff, on the fly, and have people set their status. Chat is another really great way to have people provide feedback. And as you saw on one of the last layouts that we did, the chat pod doesn't have to be the standard chat pod that you're using on every layout. So Adobe Connect enables us to add multiple chat pods so we can focus some of that conversation that's happening. We can have some people use one chat pod if they want to agree with something, use a different chat pod if they want to disagree with something. Polls are another great way. A lot of people mentioned polls when we asked how do you provide interaction in a virtual classroom. Polls do take a little more preparation. We can set them up ahead of our virtual classroom sessions, but these are another way that we can really engage people, have people provide that interaction during our sessions. We'll look at some intermediate features as well, things that may take a little more preparation and a little more planning and design, but pay off even larger. Things like whiteboards. Whiteboards don't have to be a blank white literal board that you're using. You can use annotation tools in conferencing products like Adobe Connect to start marking up existing content. I'll show you some examples of this. You can have a virtual SWOT diagram, for example, to identify strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Breakout rooms are something that I saw some people say on the poll response around interaction. Again, these take a little more preparation and design to do properly, but the payoff is huge because we can enable peer-to-peer learning. We can enable social learning where our learners are learning from each other and it's not all dependent on the host or the instructor to provide that information. Audio and video is another way that we can enable, especially in smaller classroom settings, our learners to interact. We can have anybody turn on their camera, use their microphone, and provide that experience that's maybe closer to what they get in an in-person classroom. We'll also take a look at some more advanced interaction features today. We'll take a look at things like learning interactions. We can create learning content in authoring products like Adobe Captivate, for example, and bring that into the virtual classroom to enable those learning interactions to happen synchronously in real time. Quizzes. A lot of people said quizzes on the previous poll. This is a way that we can add game-based learning into our virtual classrooms. So there's two concepts in the world of e-learning. One is gamification, where we're trying to make a game out of the learning itself. And the other is game-based learning, where we're bringing in fun games to help drive that retention rate and drive that level of engagement by having a game reinforce the learning concepts itself. So something like a Jeopardy style quiz or Who Wants to Be a Millionaire style quiz is a great way to provide that level of not just interaction, but that level of fun that somebody may be more likely to retain after the virtual classroom session. Before we get into looking at this, though, with an example, I want to talk a bit about design. Now, design is a core principle across all of the different fundamental things that we've been talking about. You need to design interaction. You need to design your content. But I wanted to separate it out for today's session because I want you to think about design as another separate principle. I want you to think about designing your learner's journey from start to finish. And that may be the email that they get to join a virtual classroom or to go and take a course, right along to the end where they're getting maybe a report or a thank you or a follow-up or even a set of action items that they need to take after the virtual classroom session has happened. So when we think about design, we tend to jump as e-learning authors directly to the content itself. I'm thinking about designing, the PowerPoint presentation I'm using in my virtual classroom session, for example. But think bigger than that. Think about that learner journey. What are they experiencing when they join your virtual classroom before you've said a word? What does that entire experience look like? Who knows what this is? Click the agree button if you know what we're looking at here. Click the red X, the disagree button, if you're not sure what this is on screen right now. About 3/4 of people, it looks like about 75%, know that this is a storyboard. Does anybody know what this is a storyboard for? Pretty obvious. It says it right in the top left-hand corner. Star Wars. Close. It's The Star Wars. At the time that this storyboard was created, the movie was still called The Star Wars. A gentleman named George Lucas, something like that, had created this storyboard for a movie that he was thinking of doing. And this is something that you see virtually every filmmaker doing. They want to storyboard out their story, their film, before they start recording it. They are essentially designing all of these shots. And the reason that that's important is because they have the eyes of the viewers and they want to guide the focus of their viewers. So they may have a wide shot, which has literally got multiple planets in, as well as a giant starship. And then they may go, at other times to a close-up shot because they want you to see the eyes of a character. This is a terrible example with Darth Vader here because he's wearing a mask. But you get the idea. We want to tell a story. And we want to tell it in a way that helps guide the focus of our viewer throughout the entire process. And so in the same way, we're going to take a look at a virtual classroom and how we can think about the learner journey and designing that learner journey from start to finish to not only incorporate all of our learning objectives, but to also guide the focus of our learners through that journey from the minute they come into our virtual classroom to when we're wrapping up and we want to leave them with some action items and what we want to give them at the end. Speaking of which, I've got a handout that I'm going to give all of you at the end of today's session. So I apologize if you've been taking notes, but I've got a kind of a 2-page handout that covers everything around content, interaction, and design, and goes through some of the things that we'll be talking about in terms of designing something that not only looks good from a visual perspective, but also helps you meet your learning objectives as you're designing these virtual classrooms. So with that, I'm going to move on to a screen share layout. I'm going to share my screen here. And what I'm sharing is a demo room that I created. The idea here is that this organization is bringing people back into the workplace This is starting to happen now all over the world, slowly but surely, and they want to do some training for their managers as people are returning to the workplace after working at home for so long. And so they've created a classroom environment. They're running this training scenario over and over again for all of the different managers in their different regions. So I created this virtual classroom as an example of how I would design something like this. And this is how Adobe Connect works if you're not familiar with it. This is very different from most of the other platforms out there in that the host designs the experience for everybody else in the room. So all of the functionality of Adobe Connect is delivered through these pods that you can see on my screen here. And each of these pods can be moved by the host, can be resized by the host simply by clicking and dragging around. And as the host, I determine what everybody else sees. So if we take a look at this room from Lisa Orange's perspective, Lisa here is a participant in the room. You can see that she can't move these pods around. She can interact with something like the chat pod, but she can't add new pods. She can't move or resize any of the existing pods. So it really is the host of an Adobe Connect room, or the instructor in the case of a virtual classroom, that really determines what everybody in this room is seeing. And so if I want to add new pods, I can go up to a pod menu and add a note pod, for example, or a video pod to share my webcam, a chat pod if I want to chat, a files pod to share files, web links to push a link to somebody, a poll pod to ask a question, Q&A pod, and any of these I can add to my stage here and design how I'd like. What you'll see down the right-hand side is a series of layouts, and these layouts are pre-grouped pods that we've put together. And so I want to draw your attention to these layouts over here. You can see as I move from one set of layouts to another, it's changing the number of pods that are on my stage. And in this way, we can set up our own storyboard for our virtual classroom to take our learners through a journey that we've designed. So we're starting up here with the lobby layout. And the lobby layout is something that we're going to use for people that joined essentially early. It's something we used in today's session. You'll notice we had music playing if you joined before the start time. We've got the same thing here. We want to entertain people as they're joining. The other thing that we want to do is start reinforcing this idea of interaction right from the start. So instead of just saying, we're going to start soon, we can start asking people to use the technology. This familiarizes themselves with the technology. They start becoming comfortable interacting by answering questions. They can start using chatbot, which will get them familiar with how that works. They may be more comfortable asking questions throughout the session if they've already started using the technology. So we can start setting that expectation right from the very beginning with the way that we're designing our lobby here. The reason we're using the music, by the way, in the bottom is not just to entertain, but it also serves the purpose of ensuring that people's speakers are turned on. They know that their speakers are working. They have confidence that they're not missing somebody speaking because they can hear audio coming from the room. So this lobby is not just a way to have people entertained before the session starts. It starts, giving them some familiarity with the technology that's being used and starts setting that expectation of interaction right from the very beginning. Next, we're moving on to a welcome introduction. And here's a quick tip, by the way. You'll notice this presentation popped up pretty quickly as I went from one layout to another. That's because I was actually hiding it behind this layout or this image. So this is a SharePod. There's a lot of stuff that we can add to a SharePod, including video, PDF documents, PowerPoint slides. But I love using SharePods just for adding images. This is telling somebody that they're in the right place. But in this case, we're using this SharePod to hide some content behind it. That way, when I move to the welcome layout, that presentation pops right up. It's a nice tip. If you're already an Adobe Connect user, this is a way to load your content lightning fast. And again here, we're loading in some content. We're designing our flow. We're using this layout to welcome everybody to the session, obviously do some housekeeping, and then moving on to an introduction layout where we started adding in some video elements, very similar to what we did today. We can start getting people on the webcam Why would we do that? Well, we want to start establishing that face-to-face contact, which is something that we're missing as we move everything online, but something that doesn't have to go away completely. We can turn on things like video as part of an introduction, even if we don't want to use it for the rest of the learning session, for the rest of the classroom. You'll notice we're keeping, typically on most of these layouts, we're keeping a consistent chat pod. So as I move from layout to layout, there's always some chat down here in the bottom right, even as I move from layout to layout. So there's always this area on almost every layout where somebody can ask a question, where they can interact with the other learners in their virtual classroom session. So that's something that we're standardizing across most of these different layouts. There are some exceptions that I'll point out, though. Next, we've got our PowerPoint layout, so we're getting into some of the content that we want to deliver. Here's where we want to think about how we want to design that content as well within that larger journey. You'll notice I've uploaded my PowerPoint deck to this room, so I'm not sharing my screen here. I'm actually loading the PowerPoint deck into the Adobe Connect room. There's a couple of benefits of doing that. First of all, if if your mouse falls off your desk, for example, and you can't click the next button, somebody else could click that for me, right? The PowerPoint is loaded into the room. My internet could shut off completely, and the PowerPoint would still stay there. And as you saw earlier, Alna was able to move the slide ahead, even though my mouse was literally lost on this mess of an office floor I've got. The other thing that we've got with uploading our content is very little bandwidth being used. In Adobe Connect, you can see your bandwidth by clicking on this connection status icon. And you can see here I'm using, not even a tenth of a kilobit here. It's in the thousandths of a kilobit upstream and only 1 kilobit downstream. And that's because I'm not sharing my screen. I'm not pushing millions of pixels through the internet. I've uploaded my deck. It takes nearly zero bandwidth, but the quality remains very high. I don't have to put up with any of that compression that you would get sharing your screen. I've also got some other nice features, some nice benefits, like the ability to skip to a specific slide without looking unprepared. I can do non-linear navigation. I can also access all of my speaker notes from PowerPoint in this notes screen. This side panel that I've just opened up is something only the instructor sees. The learners in my room don't see anything at all. As we move on throughout this particular designed room, you'll notice I've got some video here. Take a look at what I've done with this video layout. The chat pod is gone. The attendees pod is gone. There's no polls on here. This is the equivalent of a close-up in a storyboard, right? We want to guide people's focus. And for this short section, this very short video, this is not a time for interaction. I want people to watch the content, to watch this 2-minute clip. And so I'm able to remove some of those elements that aren't necessarily distracting elements. They're extremely useful, interactive elements that I want to continue to use in my virtual classroom. But what I can do as part of my design is design a layout that focuses in on something specific, so I can control the focus of the learner. Next, I've got an exercise set up here where I'm asking people how they're going to contribute to some different things when we all come back into the office, including common area precautions, protecting vulnerable employees, sanitizing the workspace. These are all chat pods. So I've continued to have this standard chat pod that's just called chat, in the same place that I've had it on almost every other layout. But in addition to having my main chat pod, I can go up to the pods menu and just add as many additional chat pods as I'd like, just by going down to chat and saying add a new chat. Now I've just added a 5th chat pod to this layout. And by doing this, by having individual chat pods dedicated to specific topics, I can raise the level of engagement by focusing the conversation. Here I'm focusing it on common area precautions. Here I'm focusing it on protecting vulnerable employees. Here I'm focusing it on sanitizing the workspace. Instead of having all 3 conversations happening in our main chat pod, where people are also, talking about other things, I'm able to really focus the conversations and turn this into an interactive exercise. And this doesn't take much work. This is a chat pod. It's something that's really easy to add on. Again, simply by going up to the pods menu, down to chat and saying add a new chat pod. But I'd really encourage you to do this. I'm renaming the chat pods, by the way, simply by double clicking on the title. And I've turned this into a much more effective exercise than if I was just on a slide and I asked people how they were doing this and they all just started using the kind of the vanilla chat pod on the layout. On my next slide here, on my next layout, I've got an assessment. And this is something similar to a learning interaction. This was actually designed in Adobe Captivate. And we're able to bring in e-learning content from authoring applications like Adobe Captivate and turn it into interactive content. So for example here, instead of just kind of going through this on their own, they can interact with the content in a virtual classroom with everybody else. So this is something where we're encouraging the learners not to sit back and just watch, but actually lean forward and interact with the content, become participants in the content. As you can see here, this particular content includes some drag and drop capabilities where you can drag users, literally social distance the individuals in a line here, and get rewarded and even track how people are doing as part of this exercise. So again, takes a little more forethought, takes a little more design, but the payoff is huge in comparing it to a PowerPoint presentation that somebody's watching versus an interactive learning exercise where somebody's actually participating. They're becoming participants. The layouts here control my flow. So if I'm going back to my PowerPoint slides here, I could go and click back on PowerPoint up here, or I can simply duplicate a layout and have it be pretty much the same layout so that it's in my storyboard, it's in my layouts panel, reminding me that after this exercise, after this assessment, I want to go back to PowerPoint slides. So it's really easy to duplicate layouts in Adobe Connect. I can create a new layout. I can start with something that's completely blank, or I can duplicate something that already exists. If I want to create a fourth PowerPoint flow, for example, I can just duplicate any one of these. Let's duplicate PowerPoint 2 here. I'm just going to call it PowerPoint 4, and it goes to the end of my session. Maybe I'll move that up till after the quiz, and it's now part of that overall flow that I'm designing into my virtual classroom session. After going through the PowerPoints a second time, you can see that we've got a layout here with some polls in. Polls are part of that first bucket of interactive content that I referred to when we were talking about the different ways that you can interact in Adobe Connect. The reason that I put it in the first bucket is because polls are really easy to use, even though they have a tremendous value in terms of getting people to interact with each other and with the host. There are 3 types of polls in Adobe Connect that you can see here. So when I add a new poll pod to my layout, let's go ahead and hide this one. I'll go to the polls section by going into my pods menu and down to polls. Let's add a new poll. And as a host, as I said, I can resize these. I can place them anywhere on my stage. There are 3 different poll types that I've got. Multiple choice, where I can ask people a question. They can have an answer. Let's ask a question here. So this is COVID related. Mostly that's not going to be contentious, hopefully, with this crowd. Let's ask a question of when should employees come back? Next week, next month, or next year. You'll notice I'm just separating these with a line space. If I make this into a multiple choice poll, I can open the poll up, and these are radio buttons. So you can select one of these different options. If I try to select a second, it changes my response. There's no submit buttons with Adobe Connect polls. You just click on the answer, and that automatically submits it. If you want to change your answer, you can change it until the poll has been closed when I hit the end poll here. If I edit this, I can turn this into a multiple answer poll. If I open it back up again, now you'll notice somebody can select more than one option. It doesn't make so much sense with this question, but you can see here, when returning to the office, what changes would you expect? It makes sense to give people the ability to select more than one option in the poll response. And then the third type of poll, if I go ahead and edit this one more time, is a short answer poll. This is something we've been using in today's session. I can just make this an open-ended question rather than giving somebody specific dates. They can type in their answer at the bottom and hit enter or click on this little arrow key. If I type in next Thursday, for example, that gets submitted up to the host. This is by default something that only the instructor or the hosts and presenters can see. If I want to have everybody see the results, I can click on the broadcast results button. And then as a host, I can see how people have responded. So there's only Lisa and I in this room right now. I can see that Lisa hasn't responded and that Alistair has responded next Thursday. If I click on something with a little more data, you can see I use this room a lot with Lisa. So I've got all of the different responses I've made. So polls are, again, a really effective way of providing interaction that doesn't require much in terms of preparation. You can design polls into your workflow. Polls are something that's easy to ask every 3 minutes or so to enable that level of interaction. We're going back to PowerPoint. This is essentially the same layout I had before, but by including it multiple times in my layouts bar here, I'm adding it to my flow. I don't have to think about where to go next. I was on polls. The next one down is PowerPoint. If I want to rearrange these, I can simply drag and drop them. And we've got a new feature that you may have seen in the video this morning where I can manage all of my layouts to quickly find something. If I'm looking for my quiz, for example, simply by typing it up here in the search bar, or I can use this to quickly rearrange any of the layouts that I've got, or quickly delete any of the layouts that I've got in this Manage Layouts mode. I'm going to go ahead and exit this Manage mode here. We've got a demo layout where I've got a blank SharePod. This is something that I'm using right now in today's room to share my screen. So I can use a SharePod in Adobe Connect, not only to share documents and whiteboards, but to share my screen, which is ideal for demos. Next, we've got a layout for breakout rooms. We're going to go into detail on breakouts in a session tomorrow. I'd encourage you to join us for that if you're interested in breakouts. One of the things that I'll point out here, though, while we're on this layout, is the pod down in the bottom right here is a share pod. And rather than having it display, a PowerPoint file or a PDF document, we've just uploaded a JPEG to this. And we can use the whiteboard annotation tools to turn this into an exercise. In this case, it's an exercise that we might want to use for breakouts, where we can have our learners select, for example, one of the pen tools. A highlighter probably works best here. They could choose their own color, and then they can start, in this case, the instructions are to circle the areas that need to be sanitized. So they can start using their device or their mouse, if they haven't dropped it on the floor, to start circling the different areas in this JPEG image that they want to sanitize. So I talked about whiteboards in that second bucket as one of the ways that we can provide interaction. As I said a few moments ago, a whiteboard doesn't have to be a blank whiteboard. We can use those same annotation tools that we have with a whiteboard on any other content in Adobe Connect. In this case, it's an image, but it could also be a PowerPoint file. It could even be a video. You can annotate on videos, just like, John Madden with a football game. I'm not sure if he's still going or not, I'll be honest. Don't watch football. Here in the third bucket, I talked about custom pods. Here's another great example of a custom pod. This is a free custom pod called Quiz Connect. I'll put a link to the apps page in the chat pod at apps.adobeconnect.com, where you can use something like a custom pod to add game-based learning to your sessions. This is a quiz game that we're going to use to reinforce any of the learning objectives that we had. So this, because we wanted to make it a game-based activity, it doesn't just test your knowledge. So I'll choose the right answer here. It actually is competitive. It's got a little timer. So the faster I answer the question, the more points are awarded. And we've got a little scoreboard over here on the right. The idea is we're doing synchronous learning. So having these competitive type activities, fun and friendly competitive activities, can be a great way to really have people engaged and have them retain this information after the session. This is, as I said, it's a completely free pod. If you're using Adobe Connect, you can go to apps.adobeconnect.com and download Quiz Connect as a way to introduce not just interaction into your sessions, but as I said, kind of game-based learning can really drive that interaction home. Here's our PowerPoint 4 layout that we just created. Again, by adding it to the flow, I know that's where I'm going next. And then we've got a wrap-up layout that we're going to before we wrap up this particular session. And on this layout, I've not only incorporated some interactive elements like testing to see whether we've met our learning objectives, for example, or in this case, understanding whether people feel prepared to go back into the office. We're using a notes pod here to kind of summarize everything that we've discussed during this virtual training session. We are using a files pod here to give people the resources that they may need to continue on, along with a bunch of different web links. The nice thing with Connect here, while I'm talking about Adobe Connect and the way that it handles these pods, is that these pods work even in a recording. So if somebody wasn't able to make the live session, they're watching the recording, they can still copy and paste this text, they can download the files, they can click on any of these web links. All of that will still work even if they're watching an on-demand recording, although they'll lose the benefit of the other interactive elements that we had throughout the session. So this is a way that we can provide all of this. We can essentially design interaction into our virtual classrooms by putting some thought into how we want that interaction to occur throughout our session, and by creating layouts that not only match our learning objectives, but that incorporate that interaction throughout the session that we're delivering. What I'm going to do now is stop sharing my screen and take you to a layout that I've created for today's session that has the handout that I referred to earlier. So I've talked a lot about content, interaction, and design. I didn't get a chance to really go through content, so this handout may come in handy for that. But this handout's got the 3 different buckets of interaction that we referred to. It talks about design. It talks about some of the different concepts that we went through as well in the demonstration. So if you're interested in that, over to the top left is a files pod called downloadable resources. You can use that to download any of the resources, download the handout that I'm making available here. So this is again, a way to think about your virtual classrooms. Instead of just thinking about maybe the PowerPoint presentation that you were planning to deliver as part of your virtual classroom, I'd really encourage you to think about the entire learner journey, right from that lobby element that they're going to see when they first join your virtual classroom to when you're wrapping up and you're talking about next steps and action items and what your learners need to do maybe to prepare for the next session. That whole thing should be designed rather than just focusing in on that content maybe that you're delivering. And as I said earlier, think about how you can design interaction into that learner journey as you're going through it. What I'd love to do now is answer any questions that we've got. Well, we've still got a few minutes left here. It looks like the team here, Peter and Alna and Matt and others, are doing a fantastic job of taking care of these questions. Is there anything I can show or answer, guys, before I move on to the wrap-up layout?
I think we're in good shape, Alistair. It looks like the team has diligently answered all the questions coming into Q&A. So I think we're safe to move to wrap up.